So at the end of the last lecture, I gave you a little context about who Martin Luther King Jr. was and kind of some of the influence that he had. And I kind of left with this argument that the way in which we kind of learn about Martin Luther King in the classroom, in particular through our K through 12 education, often doesn't do a lot of justice to who this man was and what he really stood for. And so his letter from a Birmingham jail is a document that I like to use to not only teach social movements, but also to provide some historical context as to what kind of man this really was, because I think it says a lot about sort of the dominant narrative of social movements and what they're meant to accomplish. So this chart here is data taken from what's called a Gallup poll. And so Gallup polls, they're national polling data that basically selects a random sampling of people and asks them about their maybe kind of the public opinion about a particular issue or about a particular person. And so over the course of from 1963 to 1966, and then they did this again in 2011 to see how times have or haven't changed, the Gallup poll asked participants to rate Martin Luther King on how favorable they found him. So basically they could rank him anywhere from -1 to +5. So if they ranked him +1 to +5, that meant they had a favorable opinion of him, that they found him favorable. If it was -1 to -5, it was unfavorable. They didn't like Martin Luther King. And the Gallup poll considered +4 to +5, so kind of like the highest two ratings that you can give him, as being highly favorable, and they found -4 to -5 to be highly unfavorable. So basically the two lowest scores that you could possibly give Martin Luther King if you were a participant in this poll. And I like to show this to students because it really shows what people thought of Martin Luther King when he was alive. So you'll see in 1963 to 1964, because his letter from a Birmingham jail was written in between these two dates. And so I like to show these two numbers first. When it came to total favorable versus total unfavorable in that time frame, it's like 44 to 38 in 1964 and 41 to 37 in 1963. There's not a huge stark difference between the two. And at best, the most that you could see from people's views on Martin Luther King was kind of a 50-50 split between people who liked him and people who didn't like him. And then when you take it over to the highly favorable versus highly unfavorable in those same years, that distinction becomes even more stark. You see this 9-point difference where most people had highly unfavorable opinions of Martin Luther King versus highly favorable opinions of Martin Luther King. In the time that he was alive and in the time that this letter that you had to read was written, people didn't like Martin Luther King very much. You see, and the other number that I think is really relevant there is if you look at August 1966, this is about 2 years before Martin Luther King was assassinated. So in that time, he's managed to make or help create a lot of changes, because remember, social movements are collective. He didn't do this by himself. But you've seen the end of Jim Crow segregation. The country has seen the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, these changes in legislation that provided a lot more rights to people of color in the U.S. And this is also a time where Martin Luther King is also starting to focus his attention on things like the Vietnam War and economic justice. So he's focusing on labor issues and labor movements and things like that as well. And so what you're seeing here in between 1966, 2 years before he was assassinated, is that the people who didn't like Martin Luther King has increased significantly. Now, rather than 37% of people polled having a total unfavorable view of him, you now have 63% of the people polled, twice as many as the people who liked Martin Luther King as people who didn't like him in 1966. And then that was 44% who had that highly unfavorable view of Martin Luther King. 44% versus 12% who had a highly favorable view of him. And you see in 2011, this almost like night and day. Like, we remember Martin Luther King in a very different way than we did when he was alive. But when Martin Luther King was alive, he was not a liked man. And that's largely because of how he envisioned social justice and social change. So you had to read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which explains his decision to engage in an act known as civil disobedience in the city, and why he was arrested for it, and why he was always willing to be arrested. And Martin Luther King was arrested a lot for social justice. And in his letter, he made 2 confessions to the clergymen, because this letter was a response to 8 clergymen who had written a collective statement in opposition to his actions in Birmingham, Alabama. And he made 2 confessions: his disappointment with the white moderate and his disappointment with white religious leaders. And basically what he was arguing there is that the white moderate and the white religious leaders actually had more in common with the far-right conservative, pro-Jim Crow segregation Southern white people that you see in the photo on the right, who are reacting to civil rights protesters with violence. And the reason for that is he talked about how they preferred a negative peace over positive peace, so that they're framing peace as the absence of tension, which means that just pretending like there's no conflict, over a positive peace, which meant the presence of justice, like an end to social stratification and real, true equality for everybody. And because of that, Martin Luther King saw moderates and these religious leaders as a real barrier to social change. And that's because Martin Luther King, at the end of the day, wanted radical social change. You remember the different types of social movements that we talked about in the last lecture. Martin Luther King Jr. was actually a radical. He believed in radical social change. And the civil rights movement, actually, when it was going on, people didn't really call it the civil rights movement. They called it the freedom movement, because they were looking to re-envision what democracy can even look like and make it something completely different from what it is now. And he saw this, and he saw achieving this through social movements, through nonviolence and a nonviolent campaign. And a common misconception about nonviolent campaigns is that they are passive campaigns, but they're actually not. And Martin Luther King, in this letter that you read, had identified kind of 4 basic steps of a nonviolent campaign. Collection of the facts, so gathering the data to prove that there's a problem. Negotiation. Part of what he was criticized for is, why don't you negotiate? Why don't you try talking to the people in power first? Why are you just jumping to this? And what he argues is, we did try. We did try talking. We did try having a conversation. It didn't go anywhere. And it never goes anywhere. Negotiation always fails. And so from there, you go into what's called self-purification. And self-purification is a process of preparing yourself for the reactions you're going to get for participating in a nonviolent campaign. This means training yourself to, say, for example, if someone takes a swing at you, to not fight back, to go limp if a police officer grabs you. Those things can be easier said than done. And so they go through a process of reflection, really making sure they understand why they're there, that they understand the risks to them for taking part in a nonviolent campaign, and that they can really take the violence that's going to be incited upon them without fighting back. And so this is a photo of the lunch counter sit-ins, for example, and you see the people there, they're having flour and stuff poured on their heads. People who participated in these sit-ins were beaten, they were shoved, people spit in their faces, and they endured all of this without fighting back, and that took that process of self-purification, readying your body to receive that type of violence without fighting back. And that final step, the actual lunch counter sit-ins, the protests, the rallies, that is what's called direct action. The specific things that you do in a nonviolent campaign to produce knowledge and to create a narrative around a social issue. And the purpose of nonviolent direct action, as Martin Luther King said in page 2 of your letter, is that it creates conditions that forces people to actually talk about what's going on. Because people who organize social movements are coming from a place of no one is paying attention. People are suffering, nobody seems to care, nobody is listening. And so nonviolent direct action tries to create conditions where people have no choice but to confront the issue. And direct action and knowledge production kind of work together like this. And just to reiterate, social movements produce knowledge through the use of direct action. So we talked about how social movements are knowledge producers. They do it through direct action. And so it's the use of specific strategies and tactics to call public attention to an issue. Strategies and tactics sometimes get used interchangeably, but they're actually two different things. So with strategies, you're identifying broader goals and actions that will meet that goal. And then tactics are the specific actions taken to address the strategy. So for example, you might decide that you want to protest a particular law that you feel is very oppressive, right? So, okay, so you've decided to protest. That's strategy. And so then tactic might be, you know, protest can mean a lot of different things. Maybe you're going to chain yourself to the doors of the Capitol building, or maybe you're going to, organize a march and a rally, right? So the strategy is protest, and the specific tactics, whether it's something like a march or a rally or what have you, those are the tactics. And so basically those things come together to create conditions that make it impossible to ignore the issue. And so direct action can be through formal means, like a permitted march, like going through the city and getting a permit to have a march or have a rally. Or it can be what's called civil disobedience. And so this basically means deliberately breaking a law in order to get people to question the legitimacy of that law. And so that photo on the left is a photo of Bree Newsome in South Carolina, who climbed the flagpole of the state capitol building after the massacre of 9 people in a black church by white supremacist Dylann Roof. And she climbed the flagpole to take down the Confederate flag, which had been flying over the state capitol since the 1960s in protest of the passage of the Voting Rights Act for Black voters. And so she put on climbing equipment and climbed the flagpole and took that flag down. So basically what Bree Newsome did there was she deliberately broke a law to question the legitimacy of the Confederate flag flying over the state capitol and what that was supposed to represent about racial equality in the area. And so I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I do want you to revisit this passage on page 6 of your letter by Martin Luther King, starting with the "I wish you had commended the Negro demonstrators," because one point that Martin Luther King makes here about social movements that I think is also really important to remember about all social movements. He was speaking specifically about the work that he did, but I think this applies to all of them, is that social movements and social movements are really what create real social change, are led by everyday people. They're led by people like you. You don't need to be a master orator like Martin Luther King was to create social change. It really is just kind of everyday people without a lot of resources who can make the biggest impact on the world.